Life as a Roman slave had contrasting experiences steeped in a paradox of honor and humiliation. It was a world where the glittering charm of Rome and the brutal reality of servitude collided. A realm where one served the mighty empire, yet remained shackled in the chains of bondage. So, what was it like to live as a Roman slave? Let's find out. Slavery was a reality in Roman society, a standard and far-reaching institution within the vast Roman Empire. Estimates suggest that slaves accounted for about 25% to 33% of the Roman populace between 200 BC and 200 AD. The paths leading to enslavement in the Roman world were manifold. Roman citizens traveling overseas could become victims of piracy, ending up in servitude in unfamiliar lands. Alternatively, those burdened with debts might have voluntarily entered the bond of slavery. Slaves in the Roman familial hierarchy were not homogeneous. Their experiences varied greatly depending on various factors, such as their skills, diligence, physical attractiveness, and even the whims of their masters. A fortunate few managed to ascend the household ranks, taking on oversight and management roles over their fellow slaves. This gave them a modicum of power and hastened their paths to freedom or manumission. For example, in the luxurious households of the Roman elite, both in Italy and the provinces, numerous slaves of diverse origins coexisted. This was demonstrated by Tacitus's account of Pedanius, who kept approximately 400 slaves in his employ as an urban prefect. In these households, there was a clear division within the slave class. Trusted male slaves, known as vilici, were selected to supervise the labor of other slaves, particularly in rural estates. Even more prestigious was the role of the slave educators. These individuals, tasked with the education and upbringing of their masters' children, were expected to be erudite and refined. As such, they often had a better chance of earning their freedom, further illustrating the nuanced and complex societal position of Roman slaves. Usually, the living conditions of Roman slaves were far from ideal. They typically found rest on heaps of straw, lightly covered with a blanket, in the corners of kitchens, hallways, or cramped attic spaces. This marked a stark contrast to the luxurious quarters of their masters. Jobs for Roman slaves extended beyond the household and farm labor that might typically come to mind. Many Romans employed slaves in more specialized roles to manage the affairs of their master or mistress. These roles included managers, bailiffs, debt collectors, or captains of merchant ships. One of the reasons why the Romans employed slaves in these roles was because they could punish them severely if they were dishonest or incompetent, which they wouldn't have done to citizens. Another factor contributing to the employment of slaves was the Romans' unwillingness to forfeit their independence by placing themselves at the service of an employer. This freedom-loving trait of the Romans further opened doors for slaves to perform jobs that required a certain degree of autonomy and skill. There were also opportunities for slaves to engage in semi-independent professions. For instance, a qualified Greek slave could easily become a physician or teacher. Greeks had an exceptional reputation in these fields, and Romans had a high degree of trust in their skills and professionalism. In urban areas, enslaved women served in intimate capacities, accompanying their mistresses in daily routines, assisting with bathing, hairdressing, and even child-rearing. In the rural areas, the roles of these women slaves differed slightly, often serving as kitchen maids, wives to the trusted vilici, or as maid servants working on various tasks across vast estates. The personal lives of these female slaves were strictly regulated, with prohibitions against marrying fellow slaves or keeping their own children. The sad reality was that many of these women were subjected to the sexual whims of their masters. The paranoia of Roman mistresses also played a significant role in shaping the lives of female slaves. It was common for a mistress to make life difficult for a slave she suspected was sleeping with her husband. Juvenal, the satirical poet, illustrates this with his narrative of Pescus, a female slave who bore the brunt of her mistress's jealousy, finding herself regularly at the receiving end of severe beatings. This wasn't just poetic conjecture. For many slaves, it was a brutal reality. With limited means to resist such treatment, slaves could only resort to minor acts of rebellion, such as mumbling under their breath, pilfering food, or spreading false rumors as they navigated the harsh world of Roman slavery. As for legal rights, They essentially meant nothing in the life of a Roman slave. The legal infrastructure denied slaves even the basic right to marry. While they might be allowed to establish a family unit, particularly in a domestic setting, this was entirely at the discretion of their master. Any semblance of family life they formed was fragile, subject to the whims of their master, who could separate the couple or sell one member at will. Children born into these delicate family units were likewise property of the master and were liable to be sold off and ripped away from their parents. In a notable shift, the law code of Theodosius, enacted in the 5th century AD, mandated the reunion of separated slave families under one owner. This law marked a significant, albeit minor, concession in the otherwise harrowing existence of Roman slaves. However, it's crucial to note that Roman slavery was a complex institution, and slaves could end up in vastly different roles within Roman society. In some cases, slaves could be appointed to high positions such as managers, bailiffs, debt collectors, or even captains of merchant ships. Slave markets were integral to the institution of slavery, reflecting the grim underbelly of Roman society. Slaves were common in these bustling Roman marketplaces, often standing half-nude, with a wooden sign hanging around their necks. Each sign served as an advertisement, bearing crucial details such as the slave's name, age, and unique skills. In some instances, other specifications were written to give potential buyers a full picture of the slave's capabilities. When a transaction was to take place, the law stipulated certain procedures that needed to be observed. The seller was obliged to declare if the slave was diseased or defective in any way, especially if it had the potential to diminish the slave's capacity to perform their duties. This fostered a unique legal landscape, where jurists frequently had to rule on what constituted a disease or defect due to the frequent disagreements that arose regarding a slave's performance. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking realities of the Roman slave markets was the separation of enslaved families. Mothers were torn away from their children, and each family member was sold individually. This action, beyond the inherently tragic circumstances of slavery, had a profound psychological impact on those involved. Roman slaves lived under the constant threat of severe punishment, even death. Their masters held the power to kill them without trial, employing gruesome crucifixion teams equipped with all the tools required for this brutal act. The process involved stripping and flogging the slave until they bled, followed by nailing them to a cross and breaking their legs to induce acute pain. This torment typically lasted up to 48 hours before death, and their bodies were left as warnings to other slaves. Some met their end through less torturous ways, such as being fed to lions or burnt alive, underlining the varying degrees of misery in a slave's life. So, this was the terrifying reality of life as a Roman slave, a life characterized by powerlessness, humiliation, and brutality. Despite the occasional legal concession or semi-independent profession, slaves were denied basic human rights and subjected to all kinds of suffering. If you enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Also, let us know in the comments if you want to see more videos on similar topics. Goodbye until next time.